Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be with you today. And oh, yeah, okay. Go ahead. Do what you need to do there, Eric. Before we get started, I have a favor to ask someone. If someone would be able to accommodate me. If someone has a good guitar that they wouldn't mind bringing to class, I'm a guitarist, and I'll play a couple of pieces for you, just as a bit of variety. So if somebody has a guitar they wouldn't mind trusting me with, I will, okay, either one. No, not now. Tomorrow is fine, yeah. No, you don't need to leave immediately. So thank you, yeah, great. All right, today we're going to get into a little philosophy. Still working on it? We have looked at the sort of collision of worldviews between the ancient Hebrews that comes to us from the book of Genesis and the worldviews in Egypt and Mesopotamia and Canaan. However, what we're going to be doing today is about worldviews in a more modern context, about the Christian worldview as opposed to the worldviews that surround us in the world that is not Christian. And so as we do that, that takes us into the range of what is usually called philosophy, which someone once said was the way to befuddle yourself scientifically. Well, that fell pretty flat, I can see. We'll try again later. Let me ask you something. What is a presupposition? Man, start right off with vocabulary. Jeez. Say it again? Okay, it's a possibility. It's really the kind of thing you assume would be the case. Go ahead. Yeah. It's your starting assumptions. That's a good definition. Your starting assumptions. Yeah. All right. All right, you get to move to the head of the class. Thank you, Drew. Everybody has assumptions. People that don't recognize that they have assumptions have assumptions. So that is not something you can eliminate from your perspective. It's part of being human. We have presuppositions or assumptions in many ways. And so basically your presuppositions is the basic way that you look at life, the assumptions you make about reality, about what life is about what reality is about. And so those are some of the kinds of things we're going to talk about today. This is essentially what we call our worldview. Now, probably most people do not think very seriously about their worldview. They just assume their worldview. It either comes from the culture or comes from their parents or comes from their friends or a variety of sources that are combined. But your worldview is this basic package of assumptions. Today, what we want to do is we want to think about those assumptions. And I will be posing for you quite a number of questions, and we'll work through some of those questions. It is basically the grid through which you see the world. As a Christian, you have, hopefully, a Christian grid by which you see reality in the world. If you're not a Christian, you will have some other thing that will become your grid through which you see the world. So it's what you assume to be true, what you think is right. And so today we're going to examine our Christian presuppositions, but we're going to put them side by side with the prepositions of other people in the world who are not necessarily Christians. So that's where we're going today. How's that sound? Yeah. All right, here we go. Sounds like Aristotle to me. I want to start with just some statements that are made by thinkers of various kinds and from various periods, and what I call the collision of worldviews. And I want to start with this one, which is by Jean-Paul Sartre, who is a French existentialist in the last century. How many have heard of Sartre? Okay, about a third of you, something like that. This is a statement by Sartre. Every existing thing is born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. That is a worldview. That is a set of assumptions about reality and life and meaning, or non-meaning, as the case may be. What, out of just this one statement, what can you extrapolate that would say something about Mr. Sartre's worldview? Now, Mr. Sartre, I should point out, is now dead. So he has a much better worldview now than he used to. But going back to the time when he was living and working with his old worldview, what can you extrapolate out of his statement here about the way he thought about things? Any ideas? Okay, I think that's pretty apparent. He doesn't really believe in God. In fact, Jean-Paul Sartre was an atheist. He doesn't believe in God, and if you don't believe in God, this pretty much expresses that there's not much hope in thinking about a superior being, because he's not really, that's not part of the equation for him. All right, anything else?
I think it's Darwinist, because in his worldview, things just like come out of being, and then they prolong itself. They have to lengthen their life. They come out of their weakness, and that's what Darwin sort of thought.
Okay. Sartre once said that, in fact, I'm going to write it on the board. This is one of his famous sayings. I don't know if you can read that. My handwriting is abominable. However, next week when my son gets here, his is much better, so you'll actually be able to read what he writes on the board. So this is a statement by Sartre. Existence precedes essence. Just somewhat related to what you were saying. What do you think that means? Yeah. Yeah, there's no depth of meaning to life. In fact, you don't arrive in life with any meaning. You exist before you mean anything. Existence precedes essence or meaning. And so when you come into the world, you don't have any meaning, and the only meaning you ever will have is the meaning that you create for yourself, which is really at the heart of existentialism. Existentialism is creating meaning out of action, out of what you do in life. That is what gives you meaning. But it isn't meaning that you have in and of itself. It's not a given that you have any meaning. And so Sartre is a thinker who embodies a certain range of thinking that was popular in the 20th century and has many fingers that reach over into the 21st century in the secular culture. So every existing thing is born without reason. It doesn't start with reason. It doesn't start with meaning. It prolongs itself out of weakness. We are all essentially weak creatures. Now that part I actually would agree with, but maybe for a bit of a different reason than he thinks so. And you die by chance. There is no real design to things. It just happens. Okay? So that's one worldview. Let's take a look at another one. This was by Stephen Crane. This is an American realist poet and author in the early 20th century. And this is a very short poem. This is the whole poem. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." What? What's that all about? So what is Stephen Crane saying? What can you extrapolate about his worldview out of these few lines? Yeah. Okay, man doesn't owe the universe anything, but and vice versa, really. The universe doesn't owe you anything. You're not going to get any favors just because you happen to be here. You don't have some sort of special meaning that the universe looks at you and says, well, I need to be careful with this person. That's just not the case. Okay? So it's a very bleak way of looking at life. And in fact, the American realists, which included Ernest Hemingway, who ended his life by blowing off his head with a shotgun in Idaho, for them, life only has meaning while they're doing something they enjoy. And when they quit enjoying it, there's no more meaning. And then often, enough at least, they end in suicide, which is the last stage. It's a very sad thing. Here's another one. This is a little older. This goes back to the 18th century. Alexander Pope, British English poet, wrote Essay on Man, wrote a lot of stuff, very important literary figure in the 18th century. In one of his poems, in the Essay on Man, he says in this one line, the one truth is clear. Whatever is right. So what does that tell you about his worldview?
Relative truth.
Certainly would be that, relative truth, okay? There's not certainly some overarching truth that guides you for what is right or not right, but if it exists, it is right. Could you build a society on that principle? Might be a little rough to live in. Okay? Now, I know this is all really fascinating to you and you just are enamored with these great thinkers, okay? Let me try you another one. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? This is by a very old thinker, about 3,000 years ago, by the name of David. And what can you say about this worldview as is different than the others? Pardon me? It points to a creator. It points to God, obviously. Say it again. Our value as human, we are valuable. We don't arrive without value. We are valuable because we are here. Yeah. And it's amazing to him that God sees that value in the midst of a universe with stars and planets and the moon and all of these things that God has made. David is amazed that God sees him as a valuable person. And that's why he asked the question, what is man that you care for him? With all of the other things that you have done, and yet you see me. One of the striking differences between this and the first three worldviews is that this worldview has what we call hope. And the others are extremely pessimistic. They're very dark. Hope is an incredible thing. And it is in God and indeed in the Christian faith that there is the birth of genuine hope that is not just wishfulness, but a certainty that God will do what he is intended to do, and it will be good because he is good. So you see these collision of worldviews. And so out of that then, let me ask you this. Think of someone you know, someone who is not a believer, and speculate on what some aspects of that person's worldview might be. I'm sure you all know people who are not believers. people from your hometown or friends you've met. Unless you just grew up in YWAM and you never went on outreach or something, you're bound to know somebody who's not a believer. So what do you know about their worldview? What would you speculate might be part of their worldview? Do they have hope? What do you think? Yeah, Drew.
No, but I think also when they don't believe in God, then the only hope they do have maybe is like leaving something behind for the generation.
Okay.
So it's not hope, but that sense of like,
But that gives you a sense of meaning.
yes.
If you can leave something behind, that means that your name hasn't died.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's a way of sort of substituting something for eternal life. You leave something that you're remembered by. Okay? I'm sure that would be true. Yeah.
Like all happiness and I guess quality of life is based on experiences or like.
Yes.
I don't know what it is.
It's immediate.
Yeah.
All happiness, enjoyment is immediate. In fact, one of the great changes in civilization in the last just very few decades is this penchant for instant gratification, that I need something immediate now. In fact, if you'll excuse me saying so, and maybe you won't like me after I say this, that's the reason some of you are addicted to your phones.
Come on, go there.
That little charge of dopamine in your system every time it buzzes you keeps you stimulated, and it's a continual life of immediate stimulation. I would suggest that you need to think in broader terms than that in the Christian faith, because one thing for sure in the Christian faith, delayed gratification is what you're looking at because you're not in heaven yet. And the only way you're going to get there is if you die.
Okay, but a few years ago, there was a saying that I saw in a lot of the postings and so forth, YOLO, you only live once, and
Yeah.
people want to do things, whatever that means, because you only live once, and that's all it really matters.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's actually an ancient tombstone in Rome from around the 1st century that says almost exactly that same thing. You only live once. People have been saying that for a long time because they don't see anything else. There's no horizon beyond that. Yeah, yeah. Any other thoughts on that? I'm going to get you engaged one way or another as we go along, so be prepared. How does faith affect the way that you think about the material world? This is the world you touch and see and experience. We're all pretty familiar with how faith impacts the spiritual world, but I'm talking about the material world. Yeah.
Which faces I may not have it now, but I may have it later.
Okay.
Like, as in it is evidence of things hoped for.
Okay.
And so as you're, I guess if it's not things or if it's desires or whatever, that it may not be happening right now, but you're hoping for it, therefore it will come to you.
Okay. Yeah, you hope you get old like me so you can retire, right? Sorry. Yeah.
If you think that, for example, this world is just stuff and you're part of this stuff, then it doesn't really matter if that stuff is around for a long time or if I even take care of it. Or
Okay.
Like, so implicationally thinking like, so if I believe that life is cyclical and it'll just happen again, well then what I believe about the outside world, so trees and nature, well, they may die or animals may go extinct, but they'll come back again. So I don't really have to steward the earth because it'll cycle back around. So it doesn't really matter if I throw garbage on the ground because
So if God's creation is, as he himself says, very good, then it would stand to reason that Christians would be, arguably, ought to be at least, the best stewards of that good world. What do you think? Now, I don't know that that means you need to buy into every philosophy of the green people, but nonetheless, I think as Christians, you, because of your faith and your understanding that the world is something God made that is good, then you are in the very best position to take as good care of it as you can, because it is His world. Some of you that may have come from a traditional church may have heard the old hymn, "This is my Father's world." Anybody heard that one? Three? Okay. It was written by a pastor, a Presbyterian pastor, actually in Buffalo, New York, quite a number of decades ago. But he captures this idea that the world is the world that God made. It's a good world, and we take care of it because it's His world. Well, how about the business world? Does your faith have anything to do with the way you do business? I think it ought to. I used to teach a course in ethics in Detroit. Mostly had doctors and nurses. It was with medical ethics, but we also did some business ethics. And there is such a thing as business ethics, and in fact, Jesus talks about that in His teachings, about how you actually manage things out of the context of your faith. And it would be true of family. In any case, in the end, I kind of like this statement by Aristotle: whether we will philosophize or whether we won't philosophize, we must philosophize. You do need to think about these kinds of things, because this is part of your worldview, the reality that you assume to be true. So our worldview ties together all of the different pieces of our life: matter, mind, life, death, art, science, faith, learning, and it does in fact make this a universe rather than a multiverse. Did you get that? The difference between a universe and a multiverse. It brings together all of the pieces of your life and makes sense of that. It shapes your priorities and your selectivity in your thought life. What do you think about? I heard someone say not too long ago that if you want to know what your greatest value is in life, you need to think about what you think about just before you go to sleep and just after you wake up. I thought, well, that's an interesting perspective. There may be some truth in that. If the first thing you think about is God, that may be one thing. If the first thing you think about is your car, that may lead you a different direction, or whatever it is. But in any case, your worldview guides your actions concerning the almost limitless possibilities of the things that you could do, the places you go, the things you see, the things that you do privately as well as the things that you do publicly. And it takes your world of experience, which is all of these things: medicine, leisure, money, music, society, art, education, your neighbors, your family. It brings all of these things together and makes it your world. This is your world and the way you think about your world. So let me ask you, do you think that most people adopt their worldview intentionally or by default? Probably default. And where do they get these ideas? What shapes their default concepts? Pardon? Culture. I think that's probably the biggest thing. In fact, I think that culture is replacing parentage as the primary determinant of people's worldview. If you don't go back not that many decades, it was your family and your parents who shaped your worldview. Today, that is less and less the case, and as children younger and younger are farmed out to babysitting agencies and daycare and school from early to late, and less contact with their parents, I think the culture at large becomes the big influencer. There is another factor that I think is pretty significant too, and that is that It isn't just the culture at large that now is the driver, it is the youth culture that is the driver in Western society. The youth culture in Western society drives the main culture. And what is really interesting is that this is the first time this has happened in the history of the human race. Anywhere. This has never, ever happened before in any civilization in the entire history of humanity, that the youth culture has driven the main culture. But we are, in fact, in that era now where the youth culture does drive the main culture, and it's getting younger and younger. I don't know what that's going to say in a few years, but it's certainly changing the way that we think about things, the way that we approach worldview, the way that we come to consensus community-wise about the way reality is. So here's another question. Do you think most contemporary people have an ethical center? How do they think that they know things are right or wrong? Do they have an ethical center? And if so, where did they get it? Pardon? Their conscience, okay. We have this sort of inner mechanism that kind of nudges us one way or another. What shapes your conscience? Is your conscience already sort of pre-programmed when you're born into the world? Or does your conscience get programmed sort of live as you're working your way through the world? What do you think? Pardon? Experience? Well, I think that's a big factor in shaping your conscience. Yeah?
Family values?
Family values? Sure. And general cultural values. Yeah.
What is conscience defined as?
Well, conscience is defined as sort of the inner impulse to consider things either right or wrong. Now, all humans have this. You can go to a tribal group in the Amazon basin and they have it. Theirs might end up being looking a little different than yours, but the basic mechanism is still there. Okay, so some things that they might consider wrong, you might consider okay, or vice versa. And that might be true of someone in the steppes of Russia or someone in Central Africa or wherever you're talking about. So there are different end results of this conscience idea, but all humans have this. And so far as we know, there has never been a human civilization in the history of humanity that has not had some sense of right and wrong. The ancients drew up law codes based upon this kind of idea. We talked about Hammurabi yesterday, that sort of thing. So I think most contemporary people have this impulse, but where do they get it and how is it shaped? And again, I think it's probably largely shaped by the surrounding culture. We often talk about people who are countercultural, who are sort of swimming against the tide of culture, but the funny thing is, especially, and you'll pardon me if I'm lampooning some of your contemporaries, but it's funny to me that a lot of youth want to do something different, but they all want to do it the same way. It strikes me as odd. I tried to be different once. I tried to part my hair sideways, so the front went down, the back went that way. But people always came up and whispered in my nose, so decided that didn't work so good. I told you I had worse ones. Okay. Sorry, Steve. That's the best I can do today. Now, there's a distinction that you should make between what we call data beliefs and control beliefs. Data beliefs are ordinary facts about life. It's 40 miles to the next town. The air conditioning is too cold. That's not an ordinary fact here, of course, but it is in some places. And they're the easiest to validate because they're just basically ordinary facts. You can invalidate them or you can test them for validation and so on. Everybody has a lot of those kinds of things, and those are the ones we're most familiar with. But what I'm calling control beliefs are much more difficult to assess because they are to a large degree theoretical. You can't put them in a test tube. You can't measure them with a ruler. You can't subject them to the kinds of tests that you would data beliefs. But control beliefs are much more important because control beliefs affect the way that you think about everything. From art criticism to historical explanation to psychology, philosophy, and even the way you approach the Bible. These control beliefs are the beliefs that actually make you who you are. They define you as a person. They give you value. And so basic control beliefs are beliefs like these. What you believe about metaphysics. Now that's a word you don't use every day, I know, unless you play one of these word games. But metaphysics basically means what is ultimately real? What is beyond just the physical world that I can touch and see? Anthropology. What does it mean to be a human being? Human nature. What is human nature? Epistemology. What is truth? One of the great questions in the world was the question asked by Pilate directly to Jesus. What is truth? What he didn't realize was that the real truth was standing in front of him when he asked the question. But he asked the question. How do I know what I know? I mean, sometimes you go, well, I just know that I know that I know. Well, how do you know you're not a bug? Well, I just know that. Okay, well, maybe there's a better way than just to know that you know that you know. But anyway, concepts of truth and knowledge. Redemption, this idea of solving the universal dilemma. By redemption here, I'm not just speaking here in the Christian sense. I'm speaking in the sense of what do you see to be the problem in the world? What is humanity's problem? And is there a way out of that? Is there a solution to that? Axiology, this is a word that means your values. What do you value? What do you place emphasis on? What is important? And finally, history and destiny. What is happening in the world and why? Are we going anywhere, or is history just happening? Does it have some kind of a controlling designer like God, or is it just a mass of accidents? So these are the kind of things that we want to talk about today. And so I've called these ultimate questions. These are control belief questions, not data belief questions. And we're going to start with the first one. What is ultimately real? What is ultimately real? I've used this little drawing of Leonardo da Vinci. This is his Vitruvian Man, if you're familiar with Da Vinci at all. It's supposed to be the perfect square and the perfect circle, which the perfect human fits into perfectly. Kind of an ideal sort of ideal. But anyway, here he is. And what is ultimately real? Second question, to whom am I ultimately responsible? See, it makes a good deal of difference to say I am ultimately responsible to God, or I'm ultimately responsible to the government, or I'm ultimately responsible to society, or I'm ultimately responsible just to myself. How you think about that, very, very important. Human nature, are humans good or evil? Or are they some kind of combination of good and evil? Redemption, how do humans define their problems? What are their solutions? Values, what kind of choices do I make? And on what are those choices based? Destiny, where am I going and why? So this is kind of an introduction to this whole idea of worldview. The worldview that you have should give you some things. Once you think through your worldview, hopefully, it will give you coherence. It will pull together the pieces of the way you think about life. It will comprehend all of the data, historical experience, all of your personal kinds of things. It'll explain what it claims to explain, and it will be satisfying, intellectually satisfying to the one who holds it. I put the thinker up here. This is Auguste Rodin's, the French sculptor's thinker. You've probably seen it before. It happens to be in the front of the Detroit Institute of Arts, so I have access to it all the time. And he sits out there in the snow and the frost without his clothes on, and as well as in the summer He just sits there and thinks, who am I? What am I? There he is. Now, from a Christian and biblical point of view, we start with the original state with this person called the first human, Adam. This is Michelangelo's depiction of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. By the way, you want to go to a really cool website? Google sometime Sistine Chapel virtual tour. And you can get into the Sistine Chapel and you can look at every painting by Michelangelo. You can look at the floor if you want to. You can go 360 degrees, every direction, and see everything that there is in there in really vivid depiction. So it's a cool website. So you might want to try it sometime. It has nothing to do with worldview, but anyway, it does bring me to a good joke. This is for John today. Michelangelo is on the scaffold painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So he's way up there, painting away, and this little woman comes in and starts to say her prayers. And he thought, well, I'll have a little fun with her. So she prays a few moments, and he leans over the scaffold and he says, yes? She didn't say anything. She just kept praying. He says, little lady, yes? She didn't say anything. He said, lady, I'm talking to you, yes? He said, shut up, I'm talking to your mother. Okay. Well, I even have worse ones than that. Boy, I'm not doing good today with my jokes. I can tell this is a tough crowd. All right, from the original state, as we talked about over the last couple of days, we go through the fall, in which natural thought now takes over as the primary driver of the way that humans think about things. And from that, they are alienated. They're alienated from God, they're alienated from each other, they're alienated from nature, they're alienated even from themselves. The sad state of the fallen human. And this degeneration leads to what might be called the natural person, which characterizes all of the people in the world. And they see the world through a grid. And that grid is shaped by this process. That takes them to their worldview. But on the other hand, Christians believe that the person who comes to faith in Christ Jesus goes through a process that we call regeneration. They are reborn. They are made new. In fact, Paul says they are made new in the image of the one who created them, which means that they move beyond this degeneration and, in fact, now see the world in a different way. And so they see through the grid of being born anew, born of God. And so that brings us to what I think is an important statement that Paul says. From now on, he says, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. So what do you think he means when he says that? We do not any longer regard anyone from a worldly point of view. Any thoughts about that? We even regarded Christ from a worldly point of view, but we don't do that any longer. What would be the worldly point of view that he's talking about, do you think?
A life without Christ.
Okay, certainly, a life without Christ. And how does that shape the way you think about people?
Because you don't see them, when you're in Christ, you see them as people without Christ. Therefore, you have, and then when you're in Christ, when people are not inside Christ, it's almost like you can't hold them to the same standard.
Okay.
And when you're in Christ, there's almost collective family-oriented knowledge.
Well, for one thing, it's a different set of values. The way you value human beings from a Christian point of view is rather different than the way you evaluate people from a worldly point of view. You may value people who are in your family quite a bit, but people who are business associates. You may want to take advantage of them. You may want to exploit them. All kinds of not so good things can happen when you look at people from a worldly point of view. So I think Paul's statement is a way of again, pointing out that as a Christian, we have a different grid through which we see things. We look at the world in a different way. So let's start with this question about ultimate being. What is ultimately real? That takes us to metaphysics, which is beyond the physical world, and some fundamental questions. First of all, is anything there? Now that may sound like a pretty dumb question. Everybody assumes something is there. But if you assume that something is there, you still have to ask the question, why is it there? Why is the universe here? Why am I here? You say, well, it's my parents' fault. Yeah, but you got to get beyond just that. What is important here? How did this happen? How is the universe here? And what is exactly here? I remember years ago when I was in grad school, I did a double degree. I did one in Western religion and one in philosophy. So my wife went with me to the university one day to sit in Dr. Crawford's class. And he spent an entire 2 hours talking about the hammer that wasn't there. And after about 2 hours, we're on our way home, my wife says, what in the world were we talking about? Well, we're talking about the hammer that wasn't there. Yeah, but it was there. It was on the desk. Yeah, but we're talking about the idea that could, in fact, be an illusion. See, there's some things you can actually doubt that is real, and in fact, you can doubt almost everything that is real. You can doubt that the chair you're sitting on is an illusion, because you do have dreams that things are real, and you wake up later and find out they're not. Okay? How do you know that's not happening right now? How do you know I'm real? Maybe I'm not.
You are.
Maybe I'm a figment of your imagination. Maybe I'm like Ebenezer Scrooge, who said Marley was a bit of underdone potato. Okay. If you've never read The Christmas Carol, you don't know that. But anyway, how much can you doubt of the things that you see? Theoretically, at least, how much can you doubt? Virtually everything. Everything that you see, everything you touch, everything you experience, you can say this is just an illusion. At some point, I'm going to wake up and discover that none of this is real. However, there is one thing, one bottom line thing that you cannot doubt that is real. And what is that? Yourself. Oh, see, I know, you've studied Descartes. Okay. You cannot doubt that you are real because you were thinking. If you weren't real, you couldn't be thinking about this. This is the reason the philosopher René Descartes has the famous saying, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore, I am. He is sort of shut himself in the closet in the dark. I doubt everything. I doubt the house is here. I doubt the closet is here. The clothes are here. I doubt everything. But there's one thing I absolutely cannot doubt, and that is that I'm here thinking about this. So I think. Therefore, I am. Now, he begins with that methodological doubt and begins to reconstruct what he believes to be the reality of the world based upon the principle of doubt. I will doubt as much as I can possibly doubt, and when I cannot invalidate something, then it must be real. Okay? That has become the primary methodology of knowledge seeking in the Western world. That is, you try to doubt as much as you can possibly doubt. You invalidate everything you can invalidate, and only what cannot be invalidated can remain. That, on the other hand, has led us, in the Western world at least, to atheism. Because God is not a substance. You can't measure him. You can't put him into the kinds of tests that you would, a beam of light, for instance. And so there are there is a real turning in the Western world, and by the Western world, I'm primarily talking about Europe, America, Canada, and those nations that are influenced by them. There's been a real turning toward secularism, which is the absence of God in the world. So if you take this viewpoint, then nothing in the universe outside ourselves actually corresponds to what we think of as mind, spirit, or reason. We can believe in ourselves, but we can't believe in hardly anything else for sure. We think, therefore we are, but we're not sure about anything else. I think I am, but I'm not sure you're there. Okay? Now, probably you don't think like that, regularly. But still, underlying secularism in the world is this basic methodological doubt. Okay? There's no God, there's no cause, there's no purpose, there's no morality, there's no beauty, there's no love, there's no truth other than what is created by the self and for the self. You probably have heard this phrase, there's truth for you and truth for me. This is where this comes from. Because only myself can I not doubt. So therefore all reality is subjective to me as a person. And I can't extrapolate out of that anything that's universal. Yes?
So you're saying that I think that fundamentally I have an atheist worldview.
Well, I don't think you have an atheist worldview because you think.
But if I think like that,
But if you think like that, I think you do, yes. If you start from yourself as the only reality and every other reality must be extrapolated from your own self, then it's very hard to get from there to God or to any of these other valuable things I've talked about, even beauty. What is beauty? Beauty's a little hard to define, isn't it? How would you define beauty? Now, don't look at somebody and say, that person's beautiful. Okay? Unless it's your wife or your husband. You can do that. You guys can do that. Okay. What is beauty? Something that's attractive to the eye. And why is it? Why aren't certain things attractive to the eye? Isn't that really hard to get around? Yeah. Sure, what is beautiful in one culture might not necessarily be in the other, although there are certain marks of beauty that seem to be more or less universally accepted. For instance, if you go back into ancient Egypt and you look at the bust of Nefertiti, which is the head of this Egyptian wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten, just about everybody in the whole universe thinks that she's beautiful. Why? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's symmetry, I don't know. Regularity of features, a little hard to say. But we do have this concept of beauty, and pretty much everybody in the universe has this concept of beauty. Even though it may differ from culture to culture, we have this concept. Where does that come from? But if you are truly beginning only with yourself, and then extrapolating reality out of that, it's very hard to come across with anything that beauty is other than a figment of my own personal taste. And the same would be true of love or truth. I mentioned a day or two ago, I'm in this long conversation with Dr. Bill Moore from Wayne State University, who is agnostic and a very fine intellectual. And we do a lot of talking about this idea of love because Bill is married, he has a lovely wife, and they love each other very deeply. And I'm trying to press him on this point. Do you really love your wife? Yes, I do. Why? Well, then it starts getting rocky for him because he doesn't believe in anything beyond that we would talk about metaphysics. The idea of love doesn't come from God because he doesn't believe in God. So where does this idea of love come from? And is it real, or is this just sort of a figment of his imagination? Well, it's really hard to live where your highest value is a figment of your imagination. It's hard to have meaning out of that. And so we do a lot of talking about that sort of thing. If you take this position, then existence is ultimately meaningless and everything is absurd. And people who really do come to this conclusion often go the very next step, that there is no reason not to kill yourself. It's a very empty way of looking at life. So when a modern person doubts the existence of God, do you think they have many ideas about the implications of what they're getting rid of?
No.
I think probably they don't. They don't really think through their worldview and realize that once I get rid of God, I have suddenly gotten rid of just about everything that is worthwhile at all about being alive on the earth. The modern approach to knowledge is largely Cartesian. That is, it goes back to René Descartes, based on doubt. And the implications of that approach have certainly affected religious faith. In fact, religious faith has been disappearing rapidly as secularism is on the rise. So the time, at least in Detroit, where the freeway is the least complicated is on Sunday morning, because you're pretty sure nobody's going to church much. There's a few faithful out there, but I can get downtown in 18 minutes from where I live, where normally it's an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. On Sunday morning, it's really easy. I think those are all symptoms of this basic change that has happened in the world. So let me stop at this point and see if you have any questions or input that you would like to give on this little introduction to worldview. While you're thinking of something profound, I'm going to have a drink of water. I'm having trouble hearing you, John.
If someone says they're an atheist, are they actually saying they're a secularist?
Almost always yes. Secularism and atheism go hand in hand. They aren't synonyms of each other, but they are very closely related. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The difference between what? Secularism is the behavior as though God did not exist. Atheism is the formal belief that God does not exist. So they're not quite the same. Many secular people might actually say, theoretically at least, that they believe in God, or at least they believe that that's a possibility, but they don't actually live as though that were true. They don't really pay any attention to him. He's a long way away, if he's there at all, whereas the atheist formally says he's not there. Yeah. So they're very close. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there are any subsets of atheism that have some form of hope, or do you think they're all kind of what you're
There are subsets of atheism that do have hope, and their hope is in the possibility of building a better world, a better society. In fact, it is in the context of secularism that you have that slogan that appears frequently in advertising, I think with IBM or somebody like that, that says we're building a better, who's always building a better world in the ads? TV ads, building a better world? I don't know. One of these big technological companies. But anyway, the point is that they think that if there is hope in the world, it's hope that we have to build for ourselves. It's not going to come from outside ourselves. It's not going to come from God. It's going to be something that we do for ourselves. Now, there is that kind of optimism, which I think is still pretty thin, okay? And then there is huge pessimism, when they come to the final conclusion that, in fact, there is no God and there is no hope, then it's really difficult to live with that. I mentioned Ernest Hemingway a moment ago. Ernest Hemingway, of course, wrote a lot of really important works in what is called realism, American realism, like For Whom the Bell Tolls, those kinds of works. And as he grew older, he became more and more pessimistic until finally he said to someone just a few days before he died, "There's nothing left for me. I don't enjoy food." He was having health problems. I don't enjoy sex. Can't perform anymore. There's nothing left for me. And early one morning then in his Idaho home, his wife awoke about 5 a.m. in the morning to a loud explosion, and he was in the foyer with his head in shatters, who has ended his life. Now, you have to at least give him credit that he was consistent with his beliefs. He came to the point that nothing had meaning anymore. And this gives us a reason, I think, as believers to weep for the world. This is a horrible, horrible position. But it is a position that many, many, many people are by default either at or are moving toward. Yes?
Are you going to talk about the inconsistencies within other worldviews?
We'll do some of that maybe, but part of the problem, I only have another day and a half. So normally I would teach a whole course semester in worldview. And in fact, I used to do that in the college I taught. So it's a 3-hour course for 12 weeks. So there's only so much I can get into an hour, a morning and a half. So I'm not sure how much I'm going to get into that.
I guess what I'm saying is what I understand is that Christianity is the only worldview that is consistent with itself.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So meaning like
Sure.
other worldviews contradict themselves,
Yes.
but Christianity is the only worldview that I understand is consistent with itself.
Well, I think I would agree with that. I'm not sure I'm going to have time to really explore that aspect too much. But I think out of the kind of things I'm talking about, you can already see how that can be the case. So I'm hoping that that comes across. Let me ask you another kind of question. Why is it significant to distinguish between the personal and the impersonal? Do you think people are more personal or less personal than they were, say, 20 years ago? Less? Why would you think that? I'm not disagreeing with you, but why? Do you think that we are becoming less personal? Pardon? I think technology is a big factor. Always find it interesting to see 4 people sitting at a booth in a restaurant, each of them texting to each other. And the person they're texting to is only 3 feet away. Well, maybe they're not texting to them. Maybe they're texting somebody else. But it just strikes me as sort of a symptom, if you will, of the increase in the impersonal nature of things. One of the things that I think you need to think about is the impersonal character of social media, which is different than looking at someone eye to eye and reading body language, voice tone, and those kinds of things, rather than reading a text on a screen. I mean, the dynamics are very different from each other, even though both are forms of communication, and the one is called social media as though that were an improved social structure. I'm not so sure it's that improved, because you're losing a huge amount of personhood in making that your primary form of communication. Back in the day when social media didn't exist, which actually is in my lifetime. I know I don't seem that old, but I do barely remember Columbus, that sort of thing. Back in the day, they generally said in speech therapy courses that roughly 2/3 of the communication process was body language and voice tone. That's a huge amount. And if the only way you primarily communicate is by electronic device, you've lost that whole section of communication process. And that drives you gradually toward more and more impersonal rather than personal relationships. Now, I'm not saying you should go out and burn your cell phone. I'm not trying to tell you to do that. But I do think you need to think significantly about the implications of what is impersonal as opposed to what is personal, and how that affects your life and your way of living. There's a lot at stake there. There are large implications of the creation account in Genesis beyond the obvious details, and we talked a little bit about some of those the other day. But a couple things I want to talk about. It comes from Raphael's painting, The School of Athens. Anybody seen this painting before or seen copies of it? Okay. What's this about? Who are the people in here? Have any idea? Anybody know? Okay, yeah. Well, when you start by titling it The School of Athens, that ought to give you a clue that we're talking about something that had to do with the ancient Greeks. And essentially what we're talking about are the ancient Greek thinkers, okay, which were many. I mean, they were advanced in not only philosophy, but mathematics, all kinds of ideas, even the atomic theory that the world is made out of atoms goes back to Democritus, which is a Greek philosopher 2,500 years ago. So the School of Athens is basically a way of trying to capture the key philosophical figures in Athens. The two I want you to notice particularly are the two in the middle, this one and this one. Or if we're on this side, it'd be this one and this one. And I'm going to do a blow-up of those and talk just a moment about them. First of all, the one with his hand up like this is Plato. Plato symbolizes those ways of thinking that see reality in higher forms beyond the physical world. If you've ever taken a course of introduction philosophy or something like that, you've gone through Plato's images of the cave and the shadows on the wall. Anybody, that ring a bell with anybody? Okay, you know, you've done that. And what he's trying to do with that metaphor is he's trying to say that there is a reality that is unseen. There is something beyond just physics. This is the reason many of the early church fathers felt like Plato was kind of like an early Christian, even though he wasn't a Christian and lived before Christians even existed. But because Plato had this way of thinking about reality that was beyond just the physical, they found a compatibility between Plato's thinking and Christian thought. The other one is Aristotle. How is his hand? Like this. What's the difference between this and this? Direction. Aristotle is looking down at things that are observable, things that are concrete, things that can be touched, things that can be tested. Plato is talking about things that cannot be touched. They cannot be subjected to the ordinary kinds of tests. So one of them, Plato is talking about a world beyond the world that we see. Aristotle is primarily concerned with the world that we can see, the one that is here, that can be touched, that can be experimented with and understood in that basis. Which of these two are most like modern society? Hands down, Aristotle. Aristotle, or what we call Aristotelian thought, dominates thinking in the modern world. And it's the difference between what I'm calling universals and particulars. Universals are those things that Plato is pointing upward toward, things that are beyond physics, that are truly universal, while Aristotle is concerned with particulars, things that are seeable, touchable, and so on. So to a large degree, the world since what we call the Renaissance and the Enlightenment has followed the Aristotelian approach that any understanding of reality must begin with particulars, the observable details. The larger dilemma then is how can there be any certainty about things like morals or value or even law if you only begin with particulars? If you only begin with particulars, you're going to end up with Alexander Pope. Whatever is right. Only if you can transcend that to something bigger can you have a real sense that morals, beauty, love, compassion, law, art, that these are categories that are real categories. So that brings us to the question of what? There are two concepts of reality that have always been in very sharp contrast with the Bible and the view of people of faith. One of them is called monism. That is, that there is only one stuff in the world. And everything in the universe is made out of this same stuff. It doesn't matter whether it's visible or invisible, touchable or theoretical, it's still just one stuff. This is the view, what we might call Indian mysticism. It is at the heart of Hinduism. It's at the heart of Buddhism, that there's one stuff in the world. This is the reason reincarnation is possible within that thought system, because there's only one stuff in the world. God creates the world out of himself. God is the world. And so you have this famous saying in Indian Hindu philosophy that says, Atman is Brahman and Brahman is Atman, which basically is saying that there's one stuff in the world and everything is part of that stuff. You are part of it, God is part of it, I'm part of it, the table's part of it, the cow is part of it. We're all part of one stuff, only one stuff. And eventually we will merge back into consciousness of this one stuff. That's the ultimate goal. Alongside of monism, I guess I should actually point out these other two things before I go there. In this way, God does not choose to create. He just is. He is both intelligent and non-intelligent. He is both by design and non-design. All possibilities coexist at the same time. One of the interesting features of monism is that there cannot be any final contradictions. Do you see why that would be? Have I lost you altogether? If there's only one stuff, if everything in the universe is this one stuff, then there cannot be any final contradictions. And so, you can have gods who are compassionate. You can have Kali, who's cruel. All of these at the same time, but they're still part of this one stuff. And so there's no final contradictions. Evil is therefore an illusion, not a reality. In fact, God is as much evil as he is good, because there cannot be any contradictions. So Kali, who is one of the Hindu images of God, who is cruel, who is depicted with skeletons, skulls and little necklaces around her head and knives and all this kind of stuff, she's as much God as the God who would be compassionate. So, monism is one way of looking at the world, and a huge amount of the world, in fact, is an adherence to this kind of viewpoint. The other is dualism, and this goes back to the Greeks. There are two stuffs in the world, two basic stuffs: spirit and matter. Spirit is good, matter is evil, or temporary, or dispensable. So creation is out of eternal matter, but it isn't the same as spirit. So God is limited by conditions he did not set, because matter and spirit exist eternally. They always have existed, spirit and matter. So there has always been this polarity between spirit and materialism. And finally, here, evil is necessary and evil is eternal. Yes?
Does that mean eternal matter doesn't die?
Yes. That's what it means. Yep. And since it's always been here and it will always be here, evil is necessary. Evil is the polar opposite of spirit. Now, you have some of the same idea in other parts of the world, slightly packaged differently, but if you are familiar, for instance, with the Korean flag, how does the Korean flag look? What's it look like? Well, we got Koreans here, so I know you know. Okay?
I'm American.
You're an American, okay. Well, I'm a Native American. I don't know what that makes me. So, yeah. There's a circle, and it looks something like, I need to erase this thing up here. So it looks something like this, right? Have I got it right? Not quite. Does it go this way? I have more input. Here, come here and help me. Do I go this way? Oh, you're talking about the bars? All right. Give me some help. Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Let me draw this.
Yeah, okay. You want to draw those two?
Yeah.
You know them? All right, good for you. Yeah? And then dash, right? And then start with, yep. 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 All right. There we go. All right. No, that's close enough. That'll help. Now, what you see in here are symbols of opposite ideas or polarities. I think the term for that is the yin and the yangs. Am I in the ballpark here? Almost? Okay. But you'll notice that you have these sets of opposites. Not only is this the opposite of this with straight connected or single lines is the opposite of this with the broken lines. Okay. This has a broken line in the middle and two outside straight lines, and this one has an inside straight line and two broken ones on the outside. So this is the opposite of this. But basically, this is a way of talking about the two forces in the world or the two polarities in the world. And it is not directly like the ancient Greeks, but it is similar to the ancient Greeks. It certainly is a widely held worldview within Asian communities. Just like a lot of the Greek worldview is held by a lot of people not only in the Greek communities, but people who are descendants of the Greek communities in Europe and America and so on. Both of these viewpoints, monism and dualism, are in sharp contrast with the Bible itself. And that is because the Bible has what we would call creationism, and that makes a huge difference. Now, I'm going to come back to this after break. I'm about 3 minutes over, so I'm going to let you go for your 15-minute break, and we're going to pick up with biblical creationism when we come back. All right.